Hello and welcome to the Street Art Ljubljana Conference Format Panel 4, archiving street art in contested spaces. My name is Mankica Kranec and I will be your host for today. So we have today really great panelists with us today. Every panelist has 15 minutes to present their project, and we will have 5 minutes at the end of each presentation for questions. So I kindly invite the audience to ask their questions through Kinoshishka YouTube channel, and I will select the most interesting ones at the end of each lecture. So our first panelists are Heather Shirey, Todd Lawrence, and Lorah, the co-directors at the Urban Art Mapping Research Project. They were working on an interesting topic, archiving and activism in theory and in practice, urban art mapping, George Floyd and anti-racist street art database documents, and archives examples of street art from around the world that have emerged in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in 2020 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So this is your time, and the virtual stage is yours, please.
Thank you so much. And Todd is going to get the screen sharing going right now, so I'll let him get that started. And thank you so much for having us here today. I'm Heather Shirey, and I'm an art historian at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota in the US, and co-director of the Urban Art Mapping Project. For a little bit over a year, our team has been working on systematically documenting graffiti and street art globally, creating what Stuart Hall refers to as a living archive of graffiti and street art produced in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd.
Hi, everybody. I'm Todd Lawrence. I'm a folklorist and ethnographer in the English department at the University of St. Thomas, and also a co-director of the Urban Art Mapping Project. Urban Art Mapping is an interdisciplinary, multiracial research team, and our collective backgrounds in cultural studies, geography, and art history shape the core methodology of the project. This slide shows the team members at sort of various points in our history, and the image in the bottom right is the most recent image we have of the whole team. We're having a Zoom meeting there, so that's what the team looks like in its current iteration.
Hi, everybody. I'm Paul. I'm a geographer in the Department of Earth, Environment, and Society, and I'm working with our team to analyze the relationship between street art and place. Our goal is to explore how place shapes art, and in turn, how art redefines and remakes urban space in ways that generate political dialogue, amplify marginalized voices, and promote change.
So in this very short amount of time, we'll talk a little bit about why we think it's essential to document and archive graffiti and street art produced in the context of an uprising. We'll talk about some of the challenges of this work when put into practice, and how a street art archive can be used in conjunction with spatial analysis. Our work is also shaped by Ariella Azuli's concept of potential history, and we actively reject the notion that the archive is a neutral space. And we recognize that our decisions as to what is worthy of being collected and preserved and analyzed relate directly to whose story is told. Our goal is to consciously prioritize the expressions and creative responses that are fleeting and at risk of erasure, co-optation, and recontextualization. So these are just a couple of quick examples here. The image on the left is an image that's by an artistic collective named Rogue Citizen, and this is a large wheat paste piece that's a portrait of George Floyd, and it's part of a series, and it's likely to be preserved because it's on plywood. But we also want to document and save pieces that are often produced in a manner that might lead to quick erasure, like the image on the top right is an image from outside of the courtyard during the time of jury selection for the trial of Derek Chauvin. And at that time, it was illegal to even mark anything with chalk. So these words were very quickly removed and erased. And on the bottom right is at George Floyd Square, near the site where George Floyd was killed. And here we can see a stencil that's on brick. This has actually persisted for quite a bit of time, but it won't last forever.
So as Heather was just saying, we're really interested in documenting and preserving images of all kinds of art. And this art that came up in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd here in the Twin Cities. And for those of you who don't know, Minneapolis and St. Paul are two cities right next to each other, just across the Mississippi River in Minnesota. And so in the days after the murder of George Floyd, there was uprising in both cities. So we have documented art that came up around Ground Zero in St. Paul and Ground Zero in Minneapolis. But in the immediate aftermath of the murder and then the uprising, we saw a lot of art in the streets that we knew would disappear really quickly. So this is a big part of why we wanted to document this art, because we knew that it would go away. And so in this slide, you can see some examples. Of course, this is in the bottom right is an example of the sort of large scale mural. This one happens to be in London, but it's the kind of piece that people tend to see and understand as art with their sort of preconceptions about what art actually is, as opposed to these other two pieces, the top right, which is graffiti writing on plywood boards, which of course were all over the cities to cover broken windows or to protect windows that hadn't yet been broken. And people went up with art on all of these boards all over the city. But this is a piece that when these boards came down, had no one made an effort to preserve them, probably would have just been thrown away because it would have been seen as valuable. And then of course, the top left, this pig face, which is an example of a lot of anti-police art that we saw go up across the city. We knew this would be buffed really quickly. And this is actually one of the pieces that we saw very soon after the uprising that really inspired us to try to document and archive this art.
When we first started this project, we noted that there were many articles in the popular press that provided slideshows of the best and the most creative protest art in the streets, but we saw that these articles really didn't provide any meaningful context. So it's difficult to tell the location of a work, when it went up, how long it lasted, or to identify pieces nearby that could be in communication with any given work of art. These kinds of articles and overviews often tended to favor murals and plywood panels over graffiti as well. So our work reveals that the more spontaneous and often oppositional messages that appear in graffiti, like the pig face that Todd showed us, are often frequently replaced and really quickly by sanctioned art that shifts the narrative. And so we think that documenting this change over time is meaningful. Because the context is important for us, when we created a database, we focused on metadata that would help us understand how people respond to the uprising in different locations and different times. And here's the opening page of our archive, and the link is down below if you'd like to take a look at it. The metadata we have includes a description of the work and the predominant themes, as well as a location and the date of documentation, in order to capture responses across time and place. So for example, on the next slide, we can see some graffiti that was produced at the height of the uprising, and that's on the top left. And this was really quickly buffed and painted over with a new message, really just about 10 days or a week later or so, that changed the message. So this is an example from a paint store that's on Lake Street, near the center of a lot of protests in Minneapolis. And you can see on the top left, there's a lot of really oppositional messages, a lot of anti-policing messages. And then it was painted over with permission of the business owner, probably by a commission with an artist. The graffiti was buffed or painted over, and then this large flag was painted on the side of the building with text that says "Reform, United in Love," with this kind of old style document that evokes the idea of the Constitution, really proposing the idea of love and unification solving the problem of systemic racism, and implying that this is the American way, emphasized by this flag and this document. But with this unification, there's the cost of removing and erasing the multitude of confrontational and oppositional voices that are calling to end policing.
So the database is crowdsourced. You know, we obviously can't go out and document all of these pieces, even in the Twin Cities, but we have pieces in the database from cities across the United States and around the world. It's a global database. So there are some challenges with crowdsourcing these images. Number one, the quality of the images varies. People are often sometimes taking pictures out of car windows. People were taking pictures as they were protesting. So the quality of the images is not necessarily consistent, but we accept all images no matter what quality they are, because they're a documentation of a moment in time, and that's really important to us. People submit images themselves. You can submit directly to the database. There's an actual link in the database where you can submit individual images, and then people fill in the metadata themselves. But sometimes the metadata isn't consistent. Sometimes it's not complete. People sometimes don't take note of, where the location is, the very exact location. Sometimes they don't photograph the entire piece of art. And sometimes they don't use consistent vocabulary when they're describing the art. So our team goes in and makes the changes and adds information and tries to make everything consistent. It's ongoing work. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of time, but we do this to try to make sure that the metadata is consistent over the records in the database. And as I was sort of talking before, people have preconceptions of what constitutes art, right? And they are drawn towards taking pictures of murals more than any other kind of art. And so we have this kind of ongoing project or job of trying to remind people that we are as interested in graffiti writing, tagging, that sort of stuff, especially BLM tagging, as much as any other kind of art that they're drawn to. So just in this slide right here, you can see 3 examples of pieces in the database. And this piece on the bottom right by Slug Blood is the kind of piece that people will be drawn to, right? So it reads, it's a mural, it's large, it's striking, and people see this as art, so they take a picture of it and they submit something like this. But and then on the left side, you've got a piece with a more positive message, and that often is the kind of thing that people are attracted to take a picture of. But in the top right, you see this graffiti writing on a garage door. And this is a piece that's really interesting to us as well. And this piece has been buffed and redone a few times, but for a lot of people, it doesn't read as art. It reads as property damage, or it reads as basically crime. And so they don't take a picture of it and they don't submit it to us. So part of our job is to try to, over social media and whatever ways that we have, to make sure that people know that we're interested in all these different kinds of art in the street, and that so that they will submit all of this stuff to us. And it's an ongoing challenge.
So of the nearly 2,000 works documented in our database, most have addresses, and that allows us to map the location, the distribution, and the extent of the anti-racist street art. And we think that's interesting, as most art is shaped by the context it's created in, and that's especially true for street art, because place acts as a canvas and location shapes meaning. So to analyze the geography of street art, we import information about our crowdsourced images into a geographic information system. On the next slide, you can see one result is a map layer that depicts the locations of street art here in our study area. That's the Twin Cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. Next. Each point there depicts the location of one piece of street art. On the next slide, what we find is once the data is inside our database, other maps can be overlaid on top of street art locations, allowing us to explore relationships between street art and a wide range of related variables. In this map, we mapped hotspots of property damage in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And next, you can see art within the sites of conflict we could pull. And what we found was this art tended to be quickly executed, ephemeral, powerful, and more likely to express raw anger and pain than street art located farther away. The next map displays the location of George Floyd's murder at 38th and Chicago. The geographic information system allows us to select only art in that neighborhood and to zoom in and explore its geographic content and view examples from that area. That's the next slide there, Todd.
Okay.
So there's 38th in Chicago. And in the GIS, you can see in the next slide, of those over 1,700 sites in the Twin Cities, those are the ones that are in the area of George Floyd's murder. And next, you can see from the database in the GIS, we can zoom in and we can pull images next. And you can go to the next slide for Heather.
Okay, cool. This particular piece really helped shape the work that we're doing. This appeared on the Hook, Fish, and Chicken on Lake Street, pretty close to the area that Paul was just showing us in July of 2020. And as you can see, it reads, "Don't let them change the narrative," and scrolling spray-painted graffiti alongside with stenciled text with some of George Floyd's last words. The them here being addressed is multi-layered. It's the state, it's the media who seek to shift the narrative away from George Floyd as a man who was lynched in the street to focus instead on things that are relevant to the situation, like his past arrest history, but it's also white artists and perhaps white business owners who are sometimes uncomfortable with confrontational anti-policing messages and shift the narrative to focus on ideas of unity. Our work is really shaped by our recognition that BIPOC voices and experiences are severely underrepresented in archives, and that this work of documenting voices and experiences has to be done with care without us co-opting the narrative and resisting the temptation to wrap up the story with a neat bow or envision a resolution when resolution is still evasive. This is an ongoing uprising. People have used the walls to claim space, to tell their stories, to express their anger, to show their vision for the future. And our goal is to see this and amplify these voices and experiences and make sure that these textual and visual messages are not erased.
Our work in this project is in the digital realm. We decided not to collect physical works of art for a few reasons. First, we recognize that street art is by nature fleeting and consistently changing. Packing up and storing a painted plywood board freezes the message at the moment of collection and potentially silences other messages that had come previously. It also favors works that were painted on plywood, while a digital archive can give equal attention to and therefore assign equal value to things painted on pavement, stickers on light posts, and graffiti on trash cans. Additionally, we believe that the physical works of art belong to communities and not to institutions, and that communities should control how these pieces are exhibited. That said, the digital archive serves as a complement to efforts within communities to preserve and exhibit works on plywood and other pieces of temporary protest art. The next paper in this panel, which is presented by our research collaborators, discusses the important work happening in the community to preserve and reactivate plywood panels in the community.
And finally, I'll just reiterate this notion of our belief in the archive as being a living archive following Stuart Hall's claim from constituting an archive, which you can see here on this screen. I basically just want to say, as we close up our presentation, that we see Stuart Hall's invocation as a call to action to engage in this work of crowdsourced archiving of street art. We do this with a sense of urgency as the dismantling of systemic racism requires this. Our goal is to create an archive that's not simply a passive collection of images, but that is an active agent that can contribute to the creation of a more equitable society. We also undertake this work with the recognition that archiving is slow work, and there's a vast amount of street art addressing systemic racism and police violence around the world. And with that, we ask you all out there who are watching this presentation to be our eyes in the street. And if you see art of any kind that addresses any of these issues, please take a picture and upload it to our database. We need the help of everybody out in the streets in order to preserve this really important documentation of what's happened over the last year. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So I was wondering, when you were doing this research, did you come across any other events in the past that led to similar street art reactions, which conveyed the wider public's outrage?
Yeah, events from the past prior to the murder of George Floyd, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And that's one thing that we've been thinking quite a bit about, because our archive started on June 4th, 2020 is when we started doing this work. But of course, even in the Twin Cities where we live, there's a lot of work about Philando Castile, who was also killed by the police. And there's a lot of work about his murder as well, and many others throughout the world. So we've been weighing the decision about whether to go back retroactively and to archive things that come before the time of the creation of the archive. And we haven't included those things yet, but I think we may in the future. But it is definitely expanded in terms of the scope of the archive. And there are lots of things to think about, because the idea of anti-racism, it's very broad, and it's very much all-encompassing across the world. And so there are things about, let's say, immigration practices in the United States, and things about xenophobia that we are trying to weigh about whether or not those things fit into the archive, and how we categorize them and how we piece these things together and keep it manageable, but also really expand the scope of the investigation. So some of that's unresolved. It's work in progress.
Perfect. Just one more question, and then we have to move to the next panelist. Just recently, the policeman who killed George Floyd was convicted to over 22 years in prison. Do you believe that there will be like street art reaction connected to his conviction?
Yeah, I think that there will be. We saw street art reaction to the conviction itself. We've seen street art reaction all along the way, basically. So I think, depending on how people see the sentencing, whether they see it as a just result or as an unjust result, we're going to see reaction to that. And I think I've heard Heather say in the past when we were talking about issues like this, that people seem to respond with art when there is a feeling of injustice, right? So that on the day that he was convicted, we didn't see a lot of art as a response to that, because people felt heard. People felt like a just result had come about. But on other occasions, when they felt like something unjust had happened, we see the art as part of that response to it. So I would imagine there are going to be people who are going to see this as unjust and who are going to respond to it through art in the streets.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your answers. We will move now to the next panelists, and I would like to give a word now to Adem, Ojulu, Fredrika Simmons, and Rachel Weiher, graduate students from the University of St. Thomas. They were working on a project making permanent the ephemeral. In their project, archival work serves as a form of protest. Their team strives to preserve and record fleeting protest art for future generations by implementing critical race theory as a tool for art analysis. Their dedication led to the production of a grassroots organization, Illustrated Catalog of Protest Art, to catalyze social change. So you can take it from here now, please.
Thank you for the introduction, and good morning to my colleagues in the Midwest, and good evening to our friends on the other side of the world. My name is Fredrika Simmons, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Adem, Ojulu, and Rachel Weiher to share our research with you. We are three of the graduate members of the Urban Art Mapping team, which you would have just seen presenting just prior to our slot. And based in Minneapolis, our research and our praxis over the past year has centered on artist and community responses to the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings that have occurred since. Hope not to sound like a broken record, but of course it's always important to remind ourselves that George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin on May 25th, 2020, after the former police officer kneeled on his neck for nearly 10 minutes. Chauvin is the first police officer to be charged with the murder of a Black man in Minnesota history, but has been given a sentence of only 22.5 years for his criminal charges. Our presentation today is a reflection on an exhibition of public art in honor of Floyd's legacy that we helped organize with one of our community partners. So to begin, I would like to just go over some key acronyms with everyone that we'll be referring to. The Urban Art Mapping Project, of course, is UAM. Memorialize the Movement, one of our community partners, is MTM. Save the Boards is STB. And Minnesota African American Heritage Museum and Gallery is MAAHMG. And so I'd like to begin, of course, by explaining that as members of the Urban Art Mapping team, we sought to support our community partner, MTM, in their endeavors towards producing an unprecedented exhibition by creating an interactive means through which visitors were able to engage with the interpretive materials provided. And so in light of this purpose, our research question naturally became, how do you implement universally recognized institutional best practices while producing an anti-institutional tool? And we tried to come up with an answer to that. You can tell us how well you think we did. So of course, to establish the foundation, we needed curatorial selections, an exhibition checklist, didactics, and interpretive materials. But as we were working with a community partner that was a grassroots organization that was at its time in its infancy, less than 1 year in existence, they did not have this information pre-existing. We had to develop it ourselves. So to begin with, the leaders of MTM, STB, and MAAHMG individually made their own curatorial selections utilizing photography that had been donated to MTM by the Urban Art Mapping team. And as you can see here, this is a screen grab of the shared file where those images were put. You can see here just some examples of the work that we were looking at. I should also clarify, of course, that Memorialize the Movement and Save the Boards were collecting the ephemeral plywood boards that people had been painting in the streets. Those boards had been put up to protect buildings from the riots and uprisings, but people still found a way to make that beautiful. But of course, the nature of that being ephemeral, Memorialize the Movement and Save the Boards collected those boards and were reactivating them in the public space. So they selected which images, which boards they wanted to include. And then from there, click. Oops, looks like I went a little too far. Oh my goodness. Okay, so from the image file, we then proceeded to build a spreadsheet, a pseudo-exhibition checklist of sorts. An exhibition checklist, of course, generally includes all artworks that are intended to be included in an exhibition, as well as all the didactic information. But as I previously stated, none of that was previously in existence. On this slide here, you can see an example of a checklist that I prepared for Minneapolis Institute of Art exhibition, where I also work. And in large institutions, such as the MIA, this didactic information lives within collection management software and is really easily accessible. In our case, of course, we had to build it entirely from scratch, which was no small feat for over 70 works. So now here is another screen grab of the kind of impromptu checklist that we created. You can see, of course, the panel mural names, whether or not there were photos of it in the Urban Art Mapping archive, if we knew the donor or the original location, or photography of it, accessibility description, the artist name, and it goes on and on. And then over the course of 12 hours, I assembled a 39-page document with approximately 80 records to build the didactics. Because as the checklist document gradually expanded beyond the typical didactic representation, it was really necessary to pull that data and reformat it so that we could stay organized. Again, we have the classic information of artist, title, date, location, etc. And then from there, we were able to begin formulating our interpretive materials. Although this was not in a museum exhibition, we wanted to be very careful of not being too reliant on institutional structures when establishing an anti-institutional practice. The simple truth of the matter is that decades of research have refined best practices that are really universal when asking an audience to read while engaging with visual objects. The average casual viewer has a baseline capacity, which is like a cognitive word limit, if you will, before they will stop reading and continue on. For accessibility text, it varies. Alternative text is traditionally 30 words long, with long description text going all the way to 100, 150 words. But for our purposes here, I aim to keep us at around 50 words, as you're able to see on our previous slide. And best practice is 125 words for panels and 100 to 150 words, again, for the standard extended label. But for flexibility purposes, we went up to 150 words maximum here. And accessibility was something that was really important to us and something that we wanted to be very mindful of. But I will let Adem take it away from here and talk to you all about that.
Thanks, Freddie. So as Fredrika was speaking about, accessibility is something that we wanted to be really intentional about, given the fact that Minneapolis became the epicenter of this racial uprising over the past year. There was a lot of international and even local attention and spotlight in that way. And so for us, a year later, to be able to give people that ability to view the information and also see how the community has been healing and working through all of the trauma through the past year was really important. As my colleague Rachel will speak about later, within the story map itself, we were really intentional about using that as a way for people who were not able to come to the exhibit in May to be able to access the exhibit space, the information, along with the pieces of art that we showed. So 3 of the key components within accessibility that I wanted to touch on were language, font, as well as mode of receiving information. while we weren't able to translate the language into anything beyond Spanish, as that's what we only had the capacity for, had we had more resources, we would have loved to have been able to translate our story map into further languages, including Somali, Hmong, Arabic, Karen, Ojibwa, Dakota, and many more to reflect the diversity within our community here in the Twin Cities. As far as font, within our posters, as you can see on the right, that's one of the ones we use to advertise the exhibition. Along with our web advertising, we were intentional about selecting a font that would be easy for folks to read. Not only are people able to access our story map on computers, but also on mobile devices and tablets. So we wanted to make sure that folks, regardless of the way that they are accessing the information, are still able to see it in a clear manner. And then mode of receiving information. Regardless of people's physical abilities, some folks, well, and just recognition that people receive information and learn in varying different ways. Within our story map, you're able to see that we were able to supply folks with an interactive experience. And as Freddie mentioned, we tried not to be too text heavy to ensure that we're keeping folks engaged in the works as well. Next slide, please. As we had mentioned before, we were working with an organization called Memorialize the Movement. For context, I wanted to supply their mission statement. Their mission is as follows. Our mission is to collect, preserve, and make accessible to the public the protest art that emerged following the Minneapolis uprising of 2020. This will ensure that the story of these historic events that occurred are told by the voices of the Black community who experienced them. Our work is meant to honor the original purpose of the boards, which are a means of protest and memorializing this time and place in history. We will accomplish this through continued action. We wanted to acknowledge that while we are no longer working with them, we would be remiss not to acknowledge that because the organization comprised solely of folks who were collecting the boards, it can generate many questions surrounding the interpretation of the pieces, as the artists' voices weren't always included within them. And while this isn't something we necessarily have all of the answers to, this is something we definitely wanted to acknowledge. Yeah, next slide. On this slide here, I just have an example of a side-by-side translations. So through the records that Frederica had compiled, I went through and translated the ones, the different interpretive materials for the pieces into Spanish. Like I mentioned earlier, had we had more resources, we would have loved to have supplied more language options for folks. Next slide. Here's a photo of the current urban art mapping team. We're a group of undergraduate, graduate, high school, and faculty from the University of St. Thomas. And a partnership actually formed between Memorialize the Movement and the Urban Art Mapping Group in January, as both groups recognized that they had similar goals and similar values as well. What was nice about that organic connection is that oftentimes information that Memorialized the Movement was missing, the Urban Art Mapping team had, and vice versa. And the importance of this connection is that us as academics need to recognize that oftentimes the work that we would like to be doing, folks at a grassroots level are already doing. So just really cultivating those connections with people within our community. Next slide. As I previously mentioned, Memorialize the Movement collected the boards. Some of them were donated, some of them were discarded, but because of that, there was a lot of information that they often lacked. So here's an example of the Urban Art Mapping database with a photo of some boards that Memorialize the Movement has in their possession. Next slide. Along with the further database information that Todd had actually mentioned in the presentation prior. But what is really valuable about this connection is that Memorialize the Movement was able to get in situ photos of these boards that they didn't have prior. And removing these boards from their original context and not knowing where they were originally removes a big layer of just interpretation and another layer of context that really helps bolster the ultimate interpretation itself.
Thanks, Adem. My name is Rachel Weiher, and I will be talking about the production of the story map itself. So what we wanted to do was create an accessible and easy to use gallery guide for individuals both present at the exhibit and those who weren't able to come due to COVID reasons or other reasons who wanted to view it virtually. And we used a software archive, a software platform, which has been used by quite widely, actually, including like the New York Times and other media outlets. We decided to use this software to create an actual interactive gallery guide. Next slide. Accessibility was really important for us during this production stage. Part of the things, this is a screenshot from the actual software, and you can see at the beginning, we have the panels up in front as shown by that arrow, these toggle screens, which you can click to bring you to different parts of the story map. Next slide. Within our welcome to the exhibition, we included a statement about our anti-colonial intent. This speaks to the native physical land that the exhibit is located and the call for defunding institutional brutality. By writing and speaking these truths and intentions, we work in solidarity and action to facilitate truth-telling, transparency, and progress alongside our Indigenous kinfolk. Next slide. Additionally, we created a statement about the trauma-informed care, intents, and resources included within the exhibit. Within the story map, mental health resources, insurance aid, and community care have been included. Evidence-based practices in mental health have shown that the community-based resources have been proven to be most successful interventions. By including BIPOC-specific provider information along with BIPOC providers who are available at the physical exhibit, we are working to truly create something more than a gallery guide. This story map speaks to our intentions as museum professionals and works to benefit the community it was created for. Next slide. So looking at the actual physical gallery guide that we created within the software, we used a map, and how we utilized this map was we geolocated the points of each individual mural within the exhibit. We also put in information about where our respite space was, where our mental health practitioners were, community tables, artists, stage, and as well as entrance and exits. Next slide. This is just an expanded or a close-up view, excuse me, of what these points looked like. They're a little bit kind of like look a little bit messy just because there were so many different murals and we had to geolocate each point in that mural to where they were physically located in the field. We really pushed the limits of what this software can do, but it turned out pretty well. Next slide. You are able to navigate within the map and to look at individual mural information as well as, you know, street information wide to even find out where this exhibit was located. It was located in a park, which is right next to George Floyd Square, which is the space that George Floyd was murdered at. So it's right next to that space. Next slide. How the interactive part of this exhibit worked was you were able to click on the didactic. There were 5 didactics that we had for the entire exhibit, and then murals were centered around that didactic. So when you clicked on, say, point 1, it brought up the didactic from Messages from the People. Next slide.
Sorry to interrupt. We are out of time, so if you would wrap the presentation, that would be great.
Yeah, no problem. So basically you were able to click on each point and look at and gain more information about the mural, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Just one more question before we move to the next panelist. So I was wondering, graffiti and street art are one of the tools to demand social justice. So what do you think, how much longer it will take to achieve that justice?
What a great and difficult question. I think that justice is something that's perpetually being sought after and very rarely achieved. So as long as we're making steps towards that, that's something to celebrate, but the work is never done, unfortunately.
Thank you so much. Perfect. So our next panelist is now Alexander Paulsson, a senior lecturer at Lund University in Sweden. In his paper, Graffiti as Edgework in Subterranean Stockholm, he seeks to explore how subway trains are experienced and acted upon by graffiti writers, and how their knowledge of the subway system becomes an integral part of their mobile practices. Feel free to take over from here, please. Alexander is not with us, I believe. Okay. Hello, Alexander. Okay.
Hi there. Hi there.
Hi. So I just made a little introduction of your work. So I will just give you a word, please.
Thanks for that introduction. Let's see if I can share my presentation. I hope this works. Please notify me if it doesn't. Yes, I'm going to talk about some ongoing work on graffiti writers in Stockholm, and I'm basing this presentation on the material that I'm kind of analyzing at the moment, and I'm trying to draw some preliminary conclusions, but I'm very happy to receive feedback from you. And this particular study originates from the urban creativity project that we had in Lund, and we still have, and which Peter Bengtsson, which held a keynote yesterday, has been leading together with other people in Lund. So my kind of take on this is that I want to move a bit of the discussion from the pieces and the throw-ups and all the kind of the writing to what's happening in the background of all of this. And I mean, this has been done before, so I'm far from the first person to do this, not at all, but I wanted to kind of discuss what's happening in the background in the writing and how that kind of is linked to what I would call voluntary risk-taking. And I do that by using the concept of edgework, which I will come back to in a few moments. And when I talk about kind of background, I mean the kind of infrastructure that is part of a lot of the graffiti and the writing in this particular subculture. So I will zoom in on metro trains, subway trains, and to some extent the layups and the yards, and how graffiti writers talk about these things and how they kind of experience their feelings and their emotions towards these infrastructures as part of the subculture. And as I mentioned, I draw upon the concept of edgework, and this was coined, you could say, in the early 90s, late 80s by Stephen Ling, a sociologist. And he used this work to describe how base jumpers kind of talked about and experienced their leisure, basically. And there is some sort of a dialectic here, because although he followed these base jumpers and these climbers, he also said that it's difficult to get to know this culture because you can't really express it in words. It is a feeling, or it's kind of an arousal. So there is some kind of methodological challenges involved in actually studying edgework. And my idea was to see whether edgework could be applied to understand graffiti writers and how they interact with the infrastructure that is part of kind of the train and subway systems. And this was already done in the early 90s by Jeff Farrell when he studied graffiti writers in squatters in Denver, actually. And he did that as part of kind of a larger theoretical framework, but he didn't really go into and tease out the kind of particularities of the concept of edgework. But he is drawing upon it, and I'm inspired by his work as well. And edgework, it is a bit of a tricky term because it is kind of a catch-all phrase in the sense that it captures the kind of the negotiations between boundaries between life and death, between right and wrong, and between self and others. So it is a way of kind of mastering these boundaries, and that is kind of something that gives the edge worker some sense of control and also some sense of pleasure in a way. And as it says here, it is a voluntary risk-taking. So it's not risk-taking that you're forced to, or that is part of kind of health and illness and so on. And apart from graffiti writing, it has been applied to other, base jumping, as I mentioned, climbing, but also kind of financial investors and speculation. But then the question is, and I think that's a fair question, is graffiti writing really edge work? Well, in this work, I try to make the point that, a lot of graffiti writing when it comes to subway systems and trains involves interaction with potentially illegal infrastructures. And the third rail, all of that, so I don't have to go into this. And to me, this makes the edgework concepts kind of a valuable way of kind of interrogating the work by these writers. And another aspect of this is the kind of the boundary between right and wrong, between being caught and being able to escape from the cops and the security guards. And this is something also that is a frequent topic when it comes to the stories that the writers tell in Stockholm here. So my point is that the graffiti writers in Stockholm that I have kind of followed and listened, they talk about these things, and they try to master these two boundaries and stay on the right side and control the situations, or these edge situations, as they could be called. And of course, there is a bunch of literature on graffiti writing in Stockholm, and I've tried to go through a lot of them, and a lot of that is also, I mean, of course, the painting and the writing and all the style that has grown up around certain lines in Stockholm, the red line, for example, which has its own sort of style. But there is also a lot of things written about the security guards, because Stockholm had a zero tolerance between 1995 and 2011. And the Public Transport Authority, they contracted a few security guards to basically police the system and make sure that there were no graffiti. And if a train was painted, it was kind of taken out of traffic immediately. So there wouldn't be any visual traces of graffiti. And this particular security company, CSG, they're famous for kind of recruiting former military staff and having kind of tents in the woods and kind of spying upon and kind of building kind of spots where they could surveillance the graffiti writers. So there's a lot of stories about this particular security company and how they got to know their graffiti writers and their names, the styles, and so on. And there is a podcast which has an interview with one of these guards, and it's a really kind of vivid story listening to him and his kind of knowledge about graffiti in Stockholm. But moving on then to what I have been looking at, and I've been going through a lot of kind of recorded materials and written materials as well. And while doing that, I have sort of tried to see where are the kind of accounts of edge work in this. And I've just kind of taken a few excerpts here to illustrate my point, basically, or trying to see whether the edge work concept works to interrogate what's going on. And there is this writer, Monk. He's from the Red Line in Stockholm. It's one of the three main subway lines. And when he started in the 90s, he says that he didn't make a huge distinction between riding on trains and riding on walls or a mountain wall. But later on, especially after the millennia, he says that trains had received this or gotten an elevated status. So there's a higher status in painting on trains. And of course, that involves the kind of excitement and the difficulties in getting access to the trains, because there was a zero tolerance and there were guards kind of surveilling the layups and the yards. So there were kind of bigger difficulties, you could say. And I have a quote with him here saying that graffiti is trains. It is walls along the lines and bombing insides. And Monk and his kind of friend there, Brace, they talk a lot about how they receive or get a kick when painting trains, unlike when painting a mountain wall or a wall. Moving on then, there is also in the material that I've studied a clear kind of move from getting knowledge about the layups and the yards, from actually scouting there and scoping the yards and how trains run in and out and timetables and so on, from doing that to sitting at the desk at home and looking at Google and Google Maps, trying to find ways of entering yards. So you could say that there has been a movement from the field to the desk, but there is also this movement now from the desk to the field, to kind of connect the knowledge or the overview you get from Google Maps to what's actually happening in the yards. And when the graffiti writers talk about this, they also talk about the adrenaline that rushes through their bodies when being chased by security guards and trying to find spots to enter the yards. And Bruce, one of the writers on the Red Line, if I'm not mistaken here, he also talks about scoping and mapping out in the field as a way of kind of getting a kick from doing graffiti, not only the writing and the risk of getting caught, but also kind of running around there and finding good entries to the yards. And there is another, a bit older writer, Gush. He used to have a wetsuit and swim around in central Stockholm in search for good spots, and especially on bridges, not on train bridges, if I'm not mistaken now. But he also said that he has kind of moved away from doing that. But he did that mostly because when he found these spots under bridges, or couldn't climb on bridges from the water, the pieces would last much longer. They weren't buffed. So that was his kind of rationale for doing that. But Gush and RDK, they're both family fathers nowadays. They were more active in the 90s, and both of them talk about painting trains as something that evokes certain feelings and a feeling of arousal and excitement. And RDK, he does this, and he plans some, and he's involved in missions still, although he's a bit older. And when he does that, he gets this kind of kick. However, Gush, he says that the mystery is now gone, but he sometimes joins younger writers, and then he can kind of get some sense of excitement and get the opportunity to negotiate the boundary between, life and death, if I'm going to use those terms here, or kind of what's right and wrong when being chased by the security guards and so on. And then another writer, Ras1, he says also that there is a sense of control when you're inside a yard and you know how to escape, the escape routes, and you're on a mission, and you collaborate with your friends and the crew, so you don't get caught, basically. And that gives him a sense of control and a sense of mastering the boundary, to use the language of Edgework. And a lot of other writers also mention that they get some emotional kicks and they get the opportunity to develop their style when they paint trains. So the trains have kind of become an object which combines both these opportunities to develop the style and to get this kind of emotional arousal that they talk about and seek to some extent. And basically all of them also mention that legal walls do not offer the same opportunities to get these emotional kicks. I see that I've misspelled a bit here on the presentation, but some of the older writers, Gush, if I'm not mistaken, says that he's more keen now on kind of developing his style, so he doesn't need the arousal or the emotional kicks to the same extent. So for him, the legal walls are perfectly fine. And there he don't need to negotiate the boundaries between what's right and wrong, because now the legal walls are basically legal. And then trying to wrap up all of this, I think Edgework and others have shown this before as well, offers a way to conceptualize the negotiations between the graffiti writers and how they interact with the train infrastructure and subway infrastructure. So in a way, you can conceptualize this as a negotiation between life and death, because you have to be aware and have knowledge about the third rail and the infrastructure that is potentially lethal. But there is also some edgework and negotiation of the boundaries between what's right and wrong, especially when knowing that what you do is illegal and being chased by cops and security guards and trying to find ways of escaping those. So I see edgework as a way to conceptualize the negotiations between the boundaries between life and death and right and wrong to some extent. But my point is, or what I'm trying to say in my work now, is that they try to master these boundaries, and failing to master these boundaries means that you're not really a proper writer either, because you can't really control the situation, and that's part of being a writer. And these emotional arousals and adrenaline kicks that they talk about is also something that they memorize and are fond of talking about, and they return to those experiences and emotions when sharing their experiences with other writers within the subculture. So that's basically where I'm at the moment, and I'm trying to wrap up my writings on these as well, and trying to figure out how to summarize and conclude my ideas. But I'm very, very much looking forward to input from the rest of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alexander. I was wondering, it's very interesting to hear all these stories, but among all these different public transportation vehicles, why have trains always been so attractive to graffiti writers?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, when you read the early kind of academic work on this, especially Craig Castleman's work, I mean, the trains are so much part of the culture, and as Marta talked about yesterday, the trains were a way to kind of show your pieces in other parts of the city, and Craig Castleman writes quite a lot about that in his kind of book as well. So I think trains got that kind of status early on, but the writers in Stockholm, it's funny because they say that, yeah, the trains didn't have that elevated status when they began in the 80s and 90s, some of them. It was only later that the trains got this status. I don't know really why, but I've talked to some of the pioneers when it comes to graffiti writing in Sweden, and say, yeah, but we didn't care about writing on a train or on a wall or on a power station. I mean, the style was most important.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. If any of the panelists want to ask somebody a question, just let me know. And I just have one more question for you, Alexander. I was wondering if you perhaps know, and if you can see a difference between how public operators fight against graffiti nowadays compared to the past. I know it's not exactly your topic, but it's connected to the public transport. And
no, that's a big question. I feel like I can say a few words about that from the Stockholm experience, because it hasn't been kind of a 360 degrees turn, but it has loosened up a bit, and now there are legal walls. There weren't any legal walls 10 years ago. But when it comes to fighting graffiti in the subway systems, yeah, I don't know. I think from what I've heard, I haven't really first-hand data on this, but from what I've heard, of course, drones are used to a larger extent in kind of surveilling from above what's happening in the yards and so on, but I don't really have up-to-date knowledge about that. Someone else might have. Please fill in.
Thank you so much for your input.
Mankita, I think you're muted. We can't hear you.
Somebody just muted me. Thank you so much. So I would like to give a word now to Panos Leventis, a professor of architecture at Drury University. He will discuss creative urban practices in the Eastern Mediterranean cities of Beirut, Jerusalem, and Nicosia. The grant-funded research fieldwork was done by 4 researchers from different disciplines, and the goal was to understand the character that artists and creative practices bring to the complex socio-urban structures of spaces and populations. A fictional textual narrative accompanied by collected visual data is proposed as a research practice, becoming a way of retelling the history, content, and nature of urban creative processes. The virtual stage is yours, Panos.
Thank you very much, Mankita. Thanks everyone for having me here today, and thank you and congrats on a great conference thus far. Let me share my screen. So I'll probably repeat a couple of those sentences that I just said. So this creative response contribution engages grant-funded research and fieldwork on the reciprocal relationship between street art and urban fabric in contexts of crisis. Research and fieldwork were undertaken during the 2019-2020 academic year in the Eastern Mediterranean cities of Beirut, Nicosia, and Jerusalem. The contribution crafts a fictional narrative pondering the fieldwork's intentions, the meaning of its data, and future possibilities for its applications. The fieldwork was undertaken by an interdisciplinary team of 4 researchers from 2 universities, one in the US and one in Sweden. The researchers coming from art, architecture, public policy, and urban geography. The team collected visual, textual, and interview data from streets, walls, public squares, ruins of war, artists, activists, and other citizens. Our timing was somewhat unique. We found ourselves in Beirut during the October 2019 revolution, as well as in Jerusalem during and immediately after December 2019 incident of shelling between Israel and Palestine. The resulting database serves as a comparative study of graffiti, street art, and other creative urban practices near or within contested spaces. The project was titled Contested Urbanscapes and was funded by the Swedish Foundation for International Cooperation in Research and Education as an initiation grant for what we hope will become a larger research project. Main goal of the grant and the image archive under construction is to understand the character and intensity of agency and empowerment that artists and creative practices bring to the complex socio-urban structures of contested spaces and their populations. The interview process engaged people involved in creative and public processes. We asked about their relationship with the city and its socio-urban milieu. We noted their approach to the city's history or histories of conflicts and reconciliations, and their stories and views on crisis, memory, art, and urban space. A little over 5,000 images were captured, not of 5,000 works, probably of about 500 works. We were still not done. 5 formal interviews were conducted in each city with multiple other discussions folded into the collected data. But for today, I'll put on a slightly different hat. For today's contribution, I used tools from hermeneutics and phenomenology to weave data collected from the 3 cities by telling a short story in 3 parts. 1 interview from each city served as inspiration, initiated the story sketches that you'll hear, and carries the narrative. The narrative recontextualizes urban creative practices, and this conference has done a great work so far about discussing the importance of context in street art, giving them the possibility to be understood in one of multiple voices and in one of multiple ways. So a fictional textual narrative accompanied by web and on-site collected visual data is proposed as part of a research practice. It is a way of retelling the history and content of urban creative practices, in this case, activist and by nature and intention. As such, these practices cannot be studied, understood, or interpreted unless their urban and socio-political context is also experientially engaged. We first land in the coordinates that you see on your screen. They surrounded the block in no time. They slid quickly through the thick haze. He counted at least 10, maybe 15 figures. He made out the camouflage lines through the burned trees. He saw helmets between the scaffolding. The thud of boots upset the dusty ground. But it was their guns, glimmering in the scorching heat, that stunned him the most. They looked exactly like the soldiers in his pay stubs, which filled the large, curving wall behind him. Who would have thought that his spray cans were capable of such realist exactitude? He bent down as far as he could, hoping they would not see him. Rage and fear overtook him. This time, they wouldn't just arrest or interrogate him. They had promised to make him disappear if he painted anything political again, especially if it offended the army. Any single one of the many armies, each roaming its own turf, its own zone, its own little sad world. How could he keep quiet in this corrupt, fragmented, worn-torn ruin of the city? Every morning he woke up, he made a choice to not be a victim. He spoke up, both for himself and for all those dull souls roaming the streets. And he did it with his poems, with his paintings, with his tags, with his stencils. The walls kept getting larger. He spoke to all of them. Do not forget, he told the city each and every day. One of his friends yelled to the rest of them, run. Another called out to him, Anka, get up, get out, now. They all knew very well that he could not run. The last time he ran, through a minefield at the northern border, he left his legs behind. He always said, well, at least part of me remains back home and will never become a refugee. His new wooden legs carried him well, but he could not run. A little bird landed on his head. He heard the others scurry away, some shouting, 1 shot, 2 shots. Nearby, the crowd in the square was chanting. Through the jubilation, no one would know if these were his final moments. But this time, at least, the revolution he had dreamt out for years was here. It's what he was waiting for, wishing for, needing. Everyone was fed up. They wanted their lives back. They wanted their city back. They wanted their country back. And for once, they seemed united under some sort of common cause. Was it justice, freedom, truth? And he would not survive to see this? He would absolutely survive. They will not win. They will not get me. A deep pain tore through his back. A second one repeated immediately. His eyes followed the bullets as they hit the wall. His screams echoed through the empty, curving room. His body convulsed, morphed, changed. He felt his neck elongating. He stood up. How could he stand up? He grew larger as he hovered in the middle of the huge oval. He filled the whole space. 2 bloody, yellowish-brown forms grew out of the holes in his back and became razor sharp. He tore through the roof, looking down at the oval, the egg, they called it, at the burned trees, at the ruined buildings, at the stunned soldiers, at his fleeing friends, at the chanting crowds on the square that by now were watching his flight in awe. He was their sign. The time had come. This time they would prevail. He traced lines and circles over the square. One last mark, one last sign. He stenciled the sky. Do not forget. He disappeared out west over the sea towards the setting sun. An island glimmered in the evening light of the horizon. The narrow alley butted against the round city's green line. It was deserted and dark. A faint streetlight illuminated a corner. Her face appeared behind a crumbling pilaster. She covered herself in a hood as dark as the alley and turned into the alley. She moved hastily along the boarded up storefronts and the barricaded dead ends. Her tiny silhouette was indistinguishable, except, that is, for her bright red Converse. They seemed to be hovering along as she climbed onto a half-broken second-floor balcony. She had decided on the exact spot days earlier, after surveys and careful calculations. It had to be at the correct height and viewing angle for the passers-by on the main street. She was making these for them. She wanted them to know how she felt. No, she wanted to change how they felt. No, she wanted them to just feel something again. She wanted them to wake up, speak up, rise up. She wanted them to turn their silent, divided island into a different island. She took the cans and stencils out of the basket. This was going to be her 36th piece. 36 already, she thought. Where's the list? It was a carefully prepared list with dates, times, locations, duration, and slogans used for each piece. 2 blocks away, also against the Green Line, was her architecture school. There, they always gave them carefully prepared lists. Lists of spaces and uses to be included in each project. Program, they called it. Well, this list was her program for her best project yet. Loud fluttering interrupted her. A large shadow appeared. It was not coming from the street. It was coming from above the ruined rooftops. She turned up. She saw what looked like a huge bird grabbing the roof corner with its talons and then landing right next to her. "Your shoes are so red," Anka whispered, trying to be reassuring. She stood, staring at him in silence for a few seconds, and as if unmoved by what had just happened, turned to the wall and continued her work. Anka continued. "I do what you do, in a different city, on a different Green Line, across the sea." She nodded, looked around and said, "Well, this Green Line is not really green. It's gray, it's dying, it's dead. It's keeping me from my family on the other side. So every night I add a little red wound. I try to make this half city bleed, but I only scream into the muteness of the night. I want to exist, loudly. I don't know who can change things." She sprayed the piece. Above, as always, the same image. A little black silhouette with little red Converse. Below, the slogan, that often changed, read, "Grow trees, not armies." "Armies and burn trees here too," mumbled Anka. "Armies and burn trees everywhere," she replied. "Would you like to cross the line, defeat the armies, grow new trees, see your family again?" She did not answer, just grabbed onto Anka's shoulders as he lowered his body. She held tight. They flew to the other side, the north. The silence was as deafening as it was in the south. Or maybe there was no other side, only a huge mirror. Maybe the story was different. Maybe the city was never divided. Maybe the island had always been united. United in darkness and rotting silence. "Take me away," she said, "away. To light, to a bright city, promise me." "Yes," Anka said, "to a promised city." They flew against the darkness towards the rising sun. They rode cold winds blowing into the promised land. They hovered above the promised hills. And as the first light of day illuminated the promised city, her excitement became disbelief. Below them, destruction and devastation. An enormous mechanical creature was circling the rubble. Its body glimmered in the rising sun. It was made of thousands of bolted sheets of bronze. Below the creature, under collapsed buildings, people yelled, called for help in agony. Body parts hung from broken balconies. Only burnt trees remained standing. The creature turned to face them. "It's Talos," Anka said in disappointment. He knew the story well. He just never believed it was real. Talos once protected the promised city. It threw giant boulders at anyone that threatened it. Now, each night, it's Talos who destroys the city. It circles the city, throws boulders at the city. And each day, it uses the rubble to build tall barriers. Inside the barriers, it builds hundreds of towns. Tiny towns of rubble inside tall barriers of rubble that don't communicate with each other. In these tiny towns, tiny people learn from Talos. Each day, some create poems, books, paintings, benches, gardens, houses, schools, temples. Each night, others destroy them. Some nights, not being able to see in the darkness and dust, they tear down what they themselves had constructed. Talos builds more walls to separate them. In the end, it does not know whom to separate from whom. So it destroys all the poems, all the books, all the paintings, the benches, the gardens, the houses, the temples. And it builds more barriers. It's a never-ending process. It's a never-ending promise. "I'm sorry," said Anka, landing them in a dusty yard. They were at the edge of town by the ruins of the northern gate. But Little Red raised her voice. "Being sorry is not enough. We can stop the destruction. With your wings, with my calculations, with our pieces. Even if it's the last thing we do, we'll repaint this rubble, call out to everyone, bring them together before it is too late, and we'll do it everywhere. This is my promise to all the cities." He used charred branches to sharpen his razor feathers. She finished her projections and calculations, the trajectories, the timing, the moves, the pieces. Their final flight of paint to change the story for good. They waited for the right moment. Talos was facing away from them. They moved quickly, and that's when they saw them, all of them. Inside each bronze fragment was a citizen. Each of them helped move a fragment. Each of them contributed to the destruction. The citizens, all of them together, were Talos. They were destroying themselves without end. Thousands of pieces of bronze, thousands of fragments of tiny cities, fragments and barriers and walls. Thank you.
Thank you, Panos, for your presentation. Yeah, as I was listening to your words, I was wondering if you ever fear that viewers or readers from around the world might interpret the narrative differently. Have you ever thought of that, maybe?
Yeah, I think the point is that this is an interpretation, right? So it's as a tool from hermeneutics that this is obviously based on the experience of me and my colleagues. It is also based on interviews and the experiences of the artists themselves. And it sort of gives a tool or a can opener, if you wish, to sort of open what is a very sort of closed can of a street art archive, let's say. And so these words that you heard, I hope, are just sort of one little voice, one little tool, one experience, one interpretation, a way into what I think could be sort of dubbed a more scientific sort of archive that we're building. But I see that this part is absolutely necessary, not guide, but fragment, let's say, of a larger work of research. So.
Would you be interested maybe in hearing different interpretation?
Of course, I think in the end, you know, capital T truth, you know, is the meeting point of different subjectivities. So.
I was also wondering, because, you know, the project was made in 3 different cities. What were the biggest challenges for you?
There were obviously some linguistic challenges. So we had none of the four of us spoke all the languages, so we had to have some of the pieces translated as we're building the archive. And I would say that that's perhaps the largest, or the largest hurdle that we encountered. Obviously, a lot of the pieces are visual, but then there's a lot of background work and research that has to be conducted. A lot of interviews, a lot of knowledge that has to be acquired prior to, in fact, going out in the streets. And the events of October 19 in Beirut and December 19 in Jerusalem were an added both difficulty and opportunity as we were there conducting the research. So, Nicosia, as you probably saw from the story, was silent when we went there. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for your answers and for your presentation.
I think you're muted, Monkey.
Somebody keeps on mute me. Anyway, so our last speaker is Enrico Bonadio. I hope I said your name correctly. Reader in Light City from University of London. This part of our conference will touch preservation of street art and graffiti under copyright law. And our panelists will address an issue if artists within street art and graffiti communities can use the legal tools offered by moral rights laws to preserve their art. He will explain more also by looking at recent cases. The stage is yours, please.
Thank you so much. You can see the slides, I guess, right?
Yes.
So thanks for the invitation. I'm very, very happy to be in this panel, to be in this conference. I mean, this is a topic which has kept me busy for the latest years in my research. I mean, I am a legal scholar with a deep interest in street art and graffiti. So, and in particular, I am a copyright scholar. So in the latest years, I decided to put together these two passions, right? Copyright and graffiti and street art. So I started researching on that, not only the legal analysis of the issues, but also a kind of ethnographic research. So I interviewed several, around 90 between street artists and graffiti writers, asking them what they think about copyright, they want to protect it, and in particular, if they want to preserve their artworks by relying on the law, in particular the moral rights law, the moral right of integrity, which is offered by copyright laws. I recently published this, added a collection with other contributors on this topic, as you can see, and also a photographic book where I explained with both words and mainly pictures all these issues, copyright as applied to street art and graffiti. But the best way to start this kind of discussion is to look at this case, which is very famous. Each and every one of us know about 5 Points. It was destroyed by the property owner. The 21 artists and writers, they took action against the property owner to ask for damages, right? There is a legislation, there is a law in the US, which is the Visual Artists' Rights Act, which allow artists, visual artists, to oppose the illegal destruction of their works, and in case of illegal destruction, to ask and obtain damages. And they did it. They won the case. In 2018, the New York Judge Block, awarded to these 21 artists and writers a total of $6.7 million. Lots of money. Because the property owner had not followed the right procedure. The law in America says that you are able to destroy artwork on your building if you give a 90 days notice. to the visual artist in case the artworks can be removed without being destroyed. And he did it. The property owner didn't do that, didn't follow the procedure. It went at night, in a night on November 2013, and whitewashed with cheap white paint all these artworks. And also, the judge found that 45 artworks, the 45 artworks of this litigation, had reached the required threshold, which is a kind of artistic merit threshold, right? Recognized stature. They had a recognized stature. I mean, it is a revolutionary ruling, if we think, because it is the first time graffiti and street art have received this kind of protection. Never happened before. It was legal graffiti because these guys were authorized to paint there. It was not illegal, it was legal graffiti. Then the property owner, changed his mind and whitewashed. So I think this revolutionary case, it's a revolutionary because, the former vandals winning a case against a property owner who had illegally whitewashed their works is the word upside down, because usually it is the vandal, the artist, that commits an illegal act. In this case, it was legal, of course. But I want just to stress the revolutionary nature of this decision, confirmed by the Court of Appeal last year in the same amount of money. And this case also has the potential of making these forms of art less ephemeral than they were. Street art is ephemeral, we know that, temporary. Well, after this court decision, we could say that it is a bit less ephemeral than before. Of course, I'm not suggesting that every artist, every writer now wants to protect, want to save. Of course, no. Many interviews I have made, clearly the writer and the artist says, no, I don't care. I have the pictures. Graffiti and street art are temporary. They live in photos or videos. It is still an opinion which is there in the subculture. But other artists increasingly think that if they can, they could rely on the law, copyright law in this case, the moral right of integrity, to try to save that. Of course, in my interviews, the artists that put more time and efforts, for example, murals project, which takes 1 month, of course, they are more interested potentially in protecting from destruction rather than a tagger, of course, or a graffiti writer who paints a throw up on a rooftop, right? So it's quite heterogeneous, but still there is a change, an evolution in the subculture. Of course, we need to take into account the interest of other people, the property owners, right? And judges, they need to find a balance on a case-by-case basis. They need to assess, for example, the existence of any agreement between the artist and the property owner, the length of time the artwork has been allowed to stay, the advantages obtained by the property owner from the piece. The 5 Points owner obtained an advantage because before these graffiti people, street art people, went there and kind of, took charge of the site, well, that area in New York, in Queens, was a crime-ridden area, was a very, valueless area. These guys really revamped that area with their art, with their colorful art, tourism, wedding organized there, photo shooting, and so on and so forth. So, also, another factor to be taken into account is the public interest served by the proposed new use of the property once the street artwork is removed, right? The change of destination of the building, the necessary adaptation to modern functional requirements, whether it has been commissioned or not, the cost of restoration and maintenance, and whether the owner is an organization on which a moral duty to to take good care of the cultural heritage alive. So there are several factors that should be taken into account. What about illegal street art? One may say, look, it's illegal. Of course, the property owner should be able to whitewash, to remove it, even if the artist does not agree. Of course, that this was, for example, affirmed by a judge in America. In this case, Ron English against the property owner and other artists. It was an illegal art, or it was a community art with many also architectural works, sculptures, murals. Well, the judge said, no, it's impossible to rely on the law to save illegal artworks if the property owner does not agree. Which makes sense, right? May make sense, may be reasonable. Because otherwise artists could effectively freeze redevelopments of vacant lots. You do a mural on a building and say, no, now you can't touch it, you can't remove the building, you cannot redevelop. I mean, that would be quite unreasonable, right? From the perspective of the property owners. However, in a subsequent case, the US court clarified that it's not so certain that illegal works could be removed by the property owner without violating the law. There is no basis here, said the judge, in the statute, in the law, to find a general right to destroy artworks of art that are on property without the permission of the owner. So it's still a gray area of the law, okay? There is little doubt, however, that in certain circumstances, artists, writers, street artists, they should accept the fact that, you know, if you place your mural out there, you may risk to lose control over it. I mean, many artists, of course, know that. Many don't care, they just have the pictures, of course. Also, property owners may be obliged on safety grounds to remove the wall. For example, if the wall is about to collapse, for example, right? They have some obligation by law, right? What about another treatment of street art? Not destruction, but what I call the decontextualization of graffiti. You know, with Banksy pieces, this has happened several times. People cutting. I mean, tomorrow you will talk about with Marco Proserpio about the man who saved. No, sorry, the man who stole Banksy, right? So it's a practice which you know is not uncommon. But my question is here: can the artist or the writer rely on copyright law here, on the moral right of integrity, to prevent such decontextualization? This has happened, I think, also in the case of Stick. No, this is a case which I would define of, you know, textbook case of decontextualization. Stick, a London artist, painted this mural in Poland, and after a few years, the chopped mural resurfaced on a London gallery, in a central London gallery. And the pieces were offered for sale at like 10, 12, 14,000 pounds for each chopped piece. I mean, is this okay? I mean, in my opinion, no, it's not okay. The artist should be able to object to that. But again, it's still a gray area of the law. We don't have cases. We don't have precedents. I'm pushing. I hope that judges, sooner or later, better sooner than later, will tell us it's a violation of the artist's moral right of integrity. I guess in a not so distant future, we will have some decision. I hope so. And then I want to talk about another legal way of protecting street art, not by relying on copyright, but by relying on heritage law. So here, it's not the artist who you know, makes a complaint and tries to save the artwork. Here is the local community, or even the regional or national community, national authority, more often the local authority, which takes steps to protect the artwork on heritage protection and preservation grounds. This has happened in several cases. Here I have this picture of a mural of Keith Haring in my hometown in Italy, Pisa, on the back of a church. Keith Haring painted this in 1989. It was amazing. I was in high school there, and a friend of mine said to me, look, go to Piazza Sant'Antonio there is a guy who is painting on a wall on the back of a church. I said, okay, let's go and check it out. It was June, it was very hot and warm. I went there because until that time I thought that art was just in the gallery. I was like a teenager, and I didn't know and expect that someone could paint, outside. I went there and I saw this guy on a ladder painting, and down there were these jockeys and breakdancer. I mean, it was like being in New York, basically, but it was Pisa, my town. And hip hop and, street art creed descended to my town. And then after a few minutes, I learned that this guy was Keith Haring. I didn't know him, of course. Then I started studying. And sadly, he would die just a few months later. And he has left this wonderful artwork in my hometown, which is now protected as protected good under heritage laws. So, and recently, just a few years ago, it has been restored because, of course, the colors were faded a bit, right? So they spent around 100,000 euros to 80,000 euros, the local council to protect it. That's another way of protecting legally street art, saving it from destruction or from deterioration, right? Here, it's not the artist who pushes, it's the local community represented by the local authority. There are several cases. For example, in Germany, this stencil artwork by Black Lerat was in Leipzig, in Germany, has been preserved on heritage protection grounds. Okay, so I think yes, this was my last slide. Well, the last slide is dedicated to Ljubljana. We could not travel there for COVID restrictions, but I wanted to pay homage to this town and the street art festival there. Maybe next year we will all be there physically. So I just saved a few minutes for the questions, right?
Yes, thank you, Enrico, for your presentation. I think this topic is very interesting in a sense of you can really talk a lot, right, about the copyright law. So I was wondering, like you mentioned, for instance, the law in the US. How is in Europe? It seems that it's not that strict as in Europe.
No, actually, the US is the only country which does have a law, the Visual Artists' Rights Act, which explicitly give visual artists such a tool, such a legal tool, the right to prevent or to object and to ask for damages if it is the destruction of their artworks. There is no law in other countries which explicitly provides that. In Europe, we have in some countries some cases in fine art scenarios. So, for example, cases where a canvas has been destroyed, has been mutilated, but there is no case law yet in the field of street art. I would plan to advocate for that. I mean, for a US style law. I mean, like the VARA, the Visual Artists' Rights Act. Of course, there are some oppositions that, even in America, even in the US, there are several academics, legal scholars, but even some art scholars who do not like this idea of giving artists the power to prevent the destruction of their artworks in certain circumstances. They say that, this is not okay because the owner of the artwork, so basically the owner of the canvas, or in our case, the owner of the wall, should be able to do whatever he or she likes it, right? She likes with that. But we need to find a balance, in my opinion. We need to find a balance between two conflicting interests. The interest of the artist, if he or she wants to, because I'm not here pushing for an obligation. Each artist decides what to do. In my research, many writers and many street artists have said, no, I don't care. I don't care if it gets destroyed. I have the pictures. I respect that. It's their decision. I respect that. But increasingly, there are also other artists, and to a lesser extent, writers, who would like to try to give a try and to preserve by relying on copyright. So if this is the case, why should we deny this right to those artists who are interested in doing that? Because they have spent efforts on that. It took 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month. And so it's heterogeneous. I mean, I want to keep freedom for everybody. And of course, a balance needs to be found. A balance between, of course, I mean, I cannot really come to your wall, do a tag and say, no, now you cannot do anything with that wall. I mean, it would be too much, right? We need to find a balance.
Yeah, you are right. I was also wondering, you mentioned several times photographs, right? So here we have two artists, basically, a photographer and a graffiti artist. So there is very thin line when it comes to copyrights in photography, right? So how does that work in a field of graffiti writers and photographers?
Well, there are two copyrights there. A copyright over the artwork, the mural, and the copyright over the photograph. There are two independent copyrights protecting two different works of art, because the picture is a work of art per se itself, right? But the photographer must ask permission to the artist in order to exploit, or even in order to sometimes to even take the picture and more strongly to exploit, to use commercially, for example, the picture. So the photographer will have the copyright over his or her own picture, but he or she needs permission from the artist in order to use such picture, right? So it's called derivative work. And on the other hand, I mean, a photographer of street art, I mean, making videos, photographs of street art is very important, right? Because it's an ephemeral form of art, as we said, or less ephemeral after the case. And it's important to encourage photographers to do that, because otherwise we would lose documentation of beautiful art, right? Mm-hmm. So there as well, we need to find a balance between the right of the artists and the right of the photographer, which translates in something which has a public interest, right? Because documenting such ephemeral art does have a public interest justification, right? So if you want to publish a book over fading art, both the publisher and the photographer should be put in a condition to be able to publish that book. Also because of the public interest enshrined in such venture, right? So, for example, the law of many countries provides that you are able to do that, you are able to publish the photo even if you don't have permission from the artist, unless and after you have made a reasonable search for the artist and ask for the permission. But it must be reasonable. I mean, if you can't find him or her, you must be allowed to publish it anyway in the book for documentation purposes. Of course, if it is for strictly commercial purposes, it is another matter, of course, right? So it's all an issue of balance at the end of the day, to finding the right balance between different conflicting interests.
Balance is everything, right?
Yes.
Thank you so much, Enrico. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. And I would like to thank all the panelists for their presentations and the audience for tuning in. Our next panel, number 5, Pandemic Public Space by R.J. Rushmore, will start at 6:15 sharp. So I just wish you a nice day and enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you so much.